Hi, welcome to the fifth week of computer-mediated communication. That's right, only one more week to go. Hang in there. This week we were reading stuff about the dark side of computer-mediated communication. I picked a couple of topics thinking that they would be better for you when you're at that dinner party and somebody brings up like their fears about cyberbullying or predation. But you should know there's like a much wider range of dark side topics like jealousy and stalking and all sorts of crazy stuff that I'm sorry I can't present to you. But the other benefit of me getting to show you these chapters is that they're fresh, right? Hot off the presses. Dana Boyd, who is the author, and her book, in case you didn't see the syllabus, is called It's Complicated if you want to read more stuff like this. She's really one of the top researchers in youth and new media. In fact, she's the person who came up with that definition of social network sites as opposed to social networking sites with her colleague Nicole Ellison. We also read from her. And I should warn you, if you haven't already read these, that her type of research is a little bit different than the type of stuff that I do. And so it's different from stuff in your readings. Whereas psychologists are much more into like what we'd call like quantitative research. They want to quantify things, right? She considers herself an anthropologist, and she understands people's experiences in a different way. She uses a different method. Typically, what she does is she immerses herself in some sort of culture. In this case, it's teen and adolescent culture. So she'll go to teens' homes, she'll interview them, she'll observe what they're doing, she'll observe things that are happening to them at school and reactions of their parents, maybe even interview the parents too, and try to figure out what teens are doing with social media and also how they make sense of these experiences and how they negotiate whatever conflicts they have with their experiences with other teens, their parents, administrators, what have you. So anyway, I had a hard time. I could have picked a lot of chapters from her book, but this one did have a sexy title. Danger, Sexual Predators, Lurking Everywhere. No, they're not, but that really wasn't the point of the chapter, right? The point of the chapter, in my opinion, was to sort of contextualize a lot of the fears that we have about really not just social media, but particularly social media. And what I like about this chapter is I think Boyd makes a pretty convincing argument that even before the internet, right, we were trying to control teens and adolescents. We've always been concerned, perhaps rightly so, for their safety and so forth, and that manifests itself in a lot of different ways that we've tried to get teens out of public spaces, right? We don't want them hanging out in the parks because, child molesters could get them. We don't want them in the malls because they're just hoodlums, and in various different policies you can see, maybe even things you can remember growing up, we see like this effort to take these vulnerable teens and adolescents who have maybe more independence than we're comfortable with, but are also very vulnerable because they, their frontal lobes haven't developed, so we're concerned about their safety, right? This comes across in a lot of different ways. When I was growing up, by the way, it was she talks about this concept of stranger danger, and that resonated with me because all the time we would see public service announcements about getting into the car with strangers. It would be like Cosby Show episodes and things like that, especially around Halloween. I don't see this fear as prevalent anymore, but it was all about like checking the candy when you got home because there are strangers out there that just want to poison kids. And I think a lot of that was probably unfounded. And a lot of that we've kind of dismissed, but I think they've been replaced with new fears. And that's the point she's making, I think, about our response to not our response, our fear of child predators online. She also, appropriately so, calls into question sort of our traditional mass media practices and how those can filter into our fears. So, for instance, she talks about the show To Catch a Predator, which I admit I totally watched like a lot of, right? A very sensational show that talked all the time about how we could lure these sexual predators into these traps and then reveal them for who they really were. By the way, disturbing stuff, don't get me wrong. But if that's what you're seeing, right, you get the impression that these behaviors might be a lot more common than they actually are. When in actuality, as she points out, usually it's not strangers that people are finding online that end up doing terrible things. It's the people that are already close to them in offline situations that again, end up being child molesters or abductors, whatever. Also think about how the local news tends to portray different bad things that happen to children. Just start paying attention to it. It's not to say that social media is always to blame, Facebook's always to blame, MySpace is always to blame, but it is a convenient go-to. You'll see that more often than not, they'll mention that angle if there's anything to be said about it, texting, whatever. And I think that's just our way of wanting something to blame, right? To say terrible things are happening, and if there's something we can control, then we should do something about it. But, and I think she brings this up pretty well, a lot of the things we do to control things that, crime, for instance, sexual abductions or sexual molestation and abductions are not really effective. They're just symbolic forms of control. So anyway, I love the historical context she puts us in as far as how we've always been afraid of these things and we've always been afraid of the media. Going on to cyberbullying, there's a lot of the same themes here about how maybe some of this isn't new, right? One thing I do want to emphasize is that she does something very important, which a lot of cyberbullying researchers don't even do, which is clearly define what bullying is, okay? And she relies on a really classic definition by somebody whose name I can't pronounce, but it's from the 70s, and I'm sure he's a very smart person. But she says on page 131 of this chapter, he narrowed in on 3 components that he saw as central to bullying in particular: aggression, kind of obvious, right? Aggression should be involved, otherwise it doesn't seem very bully-y. Repetition and imbalance in power. So I want to emphasize sort of this repetition issue and imbalance. The reason the repetition thing is kind of salient to me is because if you take any of my graduate courses, yeah, you could go to graduate school. If you take any of my graduate courses, we actually read in one of my courses a whole review of all the cyberbullying literature. And one of the big problems when we're trying to figure out, is cyberbullying a problem? Did social media's... Sorry, that's my dog. He's making pig noises over there. Can you see him? That's the other dog. Okay. Yeah? Could you take away Watson's pig? Or you could take Watson away too. That's good. Thanks. Sorry. Okay. He likes attention by playing with his toys. Okay, sorry. So repetition. So the problem is that if you read some of the literature on cyberbullying, all the research that's being done, people are not using a consistent definition of cyberbullying. And what happens is when you're trying to research and figure out if it's even a problem or not, let's say a scholar will go into a school system and they'll hand out a survey to lots and lots of kids, and they'll have a question on there that says something to the effect of, in the past year, have you ever had somebody say something mean about you online or something that hurt your feelings? Well, here's the problem with that. A lot of people have had that happen. Right? And if you count that as cyberbullying, then it makes it look like cyberbullying is really, really prevalent. When in actuality, maybe it's just something that happened off the cuff. Maybe it's something somebody didn't even mean. It leaves out that long-term repetition element. So you don't really get into the idea that it's like, wasn't just a one-time thing. This is like an ongoing bullying problem. So I think that's a really important thing when we're discussing these things. The other interesting thing was this imbalance of power that is supposed to define bullying, meaning that the two people who are in the bullying or bullied situation, context, right? One of them has to have more power than the other. And power can manifest itself in many different ways. But in this case, I think it means power to actually act on whatever the conflict is. So I think about, my husband watches Back to the Future all the time, and he, I think about like sort of Biff as being this classic bully, right? So Biff was a bully, and he picked on Marty McFly. He also picked on Marty McFly's dad, if you'll remember. If you don't remember, you should watch the movie, because I know it's old, but it's kind of a pop culture thing, so I recommend that. So anyway, but I would actually argue, based on this definition, that Marty McFly really wasn't bullied by Biff. Every time Biff would bully Marty McFly, he would sort of fight back, right? So there wasn't as much as a power differential as, again, what this definition would require to be bullying. Now, Marty McFly's father might be a different situation. He wasn't, getting Biff in trucks of manure and stuff like that all the time. And the reason this is relevant is because, again, through Boyd's interviews, what she was finding is that there's a lot of conflict in teenagers' lives. There's also a lot of conflict in adults' lives. But the way they define most of that is by using a term like drama, or actually it's sort of different. Like the females tend to use the term drama, males tend to use terms like punking or pranking. And really common with all of these things is there's some sort of conflict, right? It could be about gossip or people like spreading lies about each other, but it's not necessarily considered bullying, and a lot of teenagers don't consider it bullying because there is sort of an even playing field, at least as they see it, even when they're the victim of some sort of mean-spirited act, okay? So this complicates, I think, a lot of the hysteria that surrounds the cyberbullying, all the hype that comes around cyberbullying. Now, Boyd doesn't necessarily say that there's nothing new going on with the fact that whatever it is, cyberbullying or drama is happening in social network sites or in chat rooms or whatever. She does point out, and if you'll remember from our lecture, we talked about how social network sites are visible. And she talks about how these types of interactions are much more visible now. So when somebody's mean to you, it's not just for you anymore, right? Other people can see it. The other issue is sometimes this is permanent, which means that once it's out there, it's always out there. You might even delete it, but what if somebody's already taken a screen grab or filmed something? She brought up that example of the poor Star Wars boy, you know, the chunky kid who like wielded his lightsaber, and that was something that he had no control over. Once it got on the internet, it was just sort of out there. And she acknowledges that these types of characteristics from social media could make these dramatic or punking situations a little bit more traumatic. But I think what's really interesting is that she also talks about sort of an optimistic side, which is because these things are permanent and because they're visible, there's also more opportunity to recognize what's going on, to do some outreach, to do some sort of intervention when it looks like somebody is being hurt or somebody is in a bad situation. And she really actually didn't go into this as much as I had hoped she would, but I've heard her speak, and she talks a lot about how the best way to approach this, if parents do, for instance, see something on their on their kid's social network wall, isn't to necessarily ban them from social media, as a lot of parents do. Not only is it not the best thing to do, it's probably not going to be effective, but to really try to understand the situation a little bit better, because as the name of her book implies, it's complicated, right? There's a lot more nuance to these interactions. What a parent sees as bullying might be seen as drama in a teen's life, and it's important to sort of like tease these things out while still being concerned for their safety, of course. So. The only other thing I wanted to bring up really quickly was she also brings up, which I thought was super interesting, and I wouldn't have thought to connect, the influence of the celebritization of culture on all of these interactions, and how the fact now that basically anybody can become a celebrity on social media. Maybe not a celebrity like Brad and Angelina, right? But what she calls like a micro celebrity. A celebrity that has a certain following of people, maybe even people they don't know, right? But a loyal group of fans, you could say, that can follow them, leaves people in this position where, well, we can sort of treat those people like celebrities, we can sort of act like celebrities, but the truth is they're not full celebrities with the same package, right? They don't have the same financial resources or public affairs people, right? They don't have like a whole public relations team to deal with these things. And what happens is like in the same way that we've always been sort of trained to gossip about our celebrities, right? We'll read a rag about something or look at TMZ to see what happened when, you know, Beyonce did this, or Beyonce's sister, whatever. But, but the idea is we're sort of trained to do this. And what happens now that we find gossip to be highly acceptable with celebrities, and now everybody, including teenagers, there's a culture out there now to celebritize yourself. And not to say that's bad in itself, but we might need to reassess, right, how we are talking about different people in the media altogether. This isn't to say, though, that anything is really new about drama, if you will. One other thing I really like about what Boyd talks about is how all of these things are pretty normal, right? Not just for teenagers, but for adults. Maybe particularly teenagers because they require more entertainment. They're still trying to figure themselves out, resolve different types of conflicts, and negotiate their status in different social circles. But again, I mean, this is my own opinion, and we can open it up on the discussion boards. If you asked me, what's new about bullying online, I would have to agree with Boyd and say very, very little. If anything's different, it's probably the opportunities to help people out. So I'm an optimist, I guess. Okay, well, I look forward to seeing you in the discussion boards and for our last week of classes. Bye.